everyone, and thanks for being here. I'd like to start off with a little guided talk meditation that hopefully can bring us to a place where there's a recognition of the essence of the human being, the essence that is sometimes overlooked for a whole lifetime. And a lot of what is spoken about in the Satsangs here is pointing to the essence of the human being. One of the core concepts is to point out that whatever is shared in the form of words is only ever a concept. It's not the truth. A concept at best can be accurate, and it can be a useful pointer at something that is more absolute than a concept. So no matter how accurately we describe something, the description itself is never the thing itself. And so the concept says that whatever is said is a concept. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am, the impersonal sense of existence. So what it really means is that all the pointers are pointing to the truth, that which is unchanging. And the recognition of that happens when we find ourselves completely present, here and now. And a presence with what is not easy sometimes when there are a series of beliefs that exist in the system, which we're not even aware of as beliefs, that subtly keep us away from the present moment. A belief such as, I am male or I am female. Now, when we think about it, we say, well, that's not a belief. I am male or female. When it comes to presence and when it comes to looking at the essence of what we are, even a concept like that I am male or I am female, if it's held too absolutely, becomes an obstacle to the realization of something more fundamental. So if you feel like closing your eyes, feel free to do that. It's sometimes easier to see some of the more subtle aspects of the present moment with eyes closed. And I'll just run through some of the beliefs that may exist in this very moment that will keep us unaware of the consciousness that is ever present. So if we find ourselves seeking, whenever we're reading text, the word awareness, consciousness, being arises often. And it makes sense that sometimes we have no frame of reference as to what these words are really pointing at. So, if your eyes are closed, take note of what you might be relating to as the back of your eyelids. Is actually a vast open space with no edges, no boundaries, vast open space in which certain objects may arise. You might notice that the visual objects that are so often present in the daily living experience are not there. And what you are present with is an experience that in content is radically different from the ordinary everyday experience. Now, a belief may exist in this moment that says, well, I am sitting with my eyes closed in a chair. These beliefs that are deeply ingrained based on how we've come to see life and see the present moment experience can be very subtle and can keep us with being absolutely present with what is. So where is the body in this moment? Does the experience confirm the presence of a body? If the memory of the body falls away, if the memory of a body is treated as just a thought, that is not necessarily a confirmation of reality. There may be a sensation that is labeled as the thigh touching a chair. But if we're really present with the sensation and allow any labels to fall away, we'll find that the sensation doesn't tell us about a body or a chair. If we notice that there may be a belief in this moment that says there is an inside and an outside, belief attached to the idea that I am sitting in a room, sitting in a chair with my eyes closed. What is undeniable is the awareness that recognizes this present moment. The awareness that is aware of the sound objects that are arising in this moment. Awareness that is aware of the objects of sensation, touch. The awareness that is aware of the vast open space in which the objects arise and fall. This awareness is aware of any thoughts that may be floating by. Thoughts that, like the sounds, arise out of the emptiness and subside back into the emptiness. What also is undeniable is the sense of existence, the sense I am. not as a belief, not as a memory, not as a thought, but the undeniable sense that in this vast open space, as well as the functioning of awareness, which recognizes all the objects arising in this moment, there is the undeniable sense of existence. The sense of existence doesn't tell us what exists, but if I ask the question, are you dead? You don't need to conceptualize the answer to that question. The sense of existence tells us I am. I exist. It's these two functionings of consciousness, awareness and the sense of existence, that are ever present in each moment. Awareness has to be there in order to recognize the content of experience. In this moment, if what we call eyes closed is there, the body is not verifiable. Maybe some vague sensations, and not much more than that. And even with the absence of the body as part of the experience, the sense I am and awareness is ever present. This awareness is formless. The awareness doesn't think. The awareness doesn't do anything. Awareness is still, all-pervading, and simply witnesses. Awares all of the objects of perception, of thought, of emotions that arise in the present moment. And should you open your eyes, what is called opening our eyes reveals a brand new experience. The experience from moments ago has changed radically. The visual images that we are so used to as what we call daily living arise and fill the space. And there is an awareness of this experience. The body is an object, part of this experience, that is witnessed by the awareness that is aware of all experience. And if what we call closing our eyes happens, from a point of presence, the experience has changed radically. The visual component of the experience has fallen away. If thoughts that say, I am sitting in a chair with my eyes closed in a room, are not taken to be truth, treated as thought, we may find that we're present with the experience exactly as it is. Without the presence of visual images, the sense of space falls away. Time falls away. And what is ever present is the awareness and the sense of existence. That is the basic element of all experience. If thoughts are arising, maybe they are witnessed as an object in this space. And the awareness doesn't need to do anything. It can simply allow everything to be as it is. To the extent that we live life unaware of this ever-present aspect of experience, the aspect of awareness and the sense of existence, we tend to live life identified solely with the objective form, unaware of the essence that is the core of every human being. This essence, this awareness remains unaffected by whatever arises in each moment. This awareness is not part of the changing experience that comes and goes. To the extent that we only know ourselves as that which changes, that which is physical, then life tends to be a threat to that which is physical. If we find ourselves grounding and able to rest in this being, knowing ourselves to exist in each moment as something unaffected by what happens in the flow of life, then what happens in the flow of life becomes less relevant. So all of the talks focus around one central theme, and that theme is happiness in daily living. So the teaching suggests that if we find ourselves seeking, it makes sense for us to ask a very important question. And that question is, what am I really looking for? Sometimes we might find ourselves seeking for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And Ramesh, this is Ramesh, my teacher, would say he would find people sitting in front of him after 30 years of seeking, with tears in their eyes, frustrated. Frustrated because in all of that time, this question, what am I really looking for, hasn't been asked. And if the question hasn't been asked, and a very simple, clear, precise answer hasn't been given or found for oneself based on one's own investigation, then it makes sense that the seeking might happen in a very unfocused way. We might find ourselves going round and round in circles. And so it makes sense to ask the question and make sure we come up with an answer that is satisfactory and accurate. So if we were to say the answer to that question is enlightenment, I'm seeking enlightenment, and then we set off on our merry way, I would suggest that that's not a useful answer to the question. Because enlightenment is a word. What does it really mean? So if we're about to embark on a search that can sometimes become all-consuming, the most important thing, it makes sense to be clear on what I'm searching for. So as I mentioned at the beginning, whatever is spoken about here is a concept. Any teaching that has ever existed in all of time is a set of concepts, pointers, and a good teaching points out not to mistake the pointers as the truth itself. So when I put forward an answer to that question, it's a suggestion. It's an opportunity for you to investigate for yourself and see if that makes sense to you. Not to believe the answer put forward, but just to use it as a guide. And the suggestion is that the answer to that question is happiness for Roger in this life. And Marcus is looking for happiness for Marcus in this life, not in some future life, but right now. And if we left it at that, that would almost be as ineffective an answer as enlightenment, because happiness is also just a word. What really is happiness? And if we look at human history, if we look at the movement of humans, what we see is that the definition that humans have of happiness is happiness through pleasure, happiness through circumstance. And humans are looking for happiness, But what we find is that humans are looking for happiness in a place where it can't be found. And we know this from our own experience, that we find ourselves seeking for happiness through pleasure. We get pleasure, and that pleasure is pleasurable, but it very clearly doesn't deliver continuous unbroken happiness. And yet, the belief is so deeply ingrained that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, that even having our own first-hand experience that shows us, I have received the happiness, the pleasure that I'm looking for. I have got the job promotion that I was hoping for. I have found myself in a house that I like. And no doubt this is pleasurable, but it doesn't deliver continuous unbroken happiness. So the suggestion is that happiness for the human being, whether we realize it or not, is never to be found in the flow of life, which is always only ever pleasure or pain, but rather happiness for the human being is continuous unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance that we find ourselves in. And that peace of mind is a result not of the content of the moment, which is only ever pleasure or pain, but is a result of our attitude to the moment, our attitude to the pleasure or pain. And so, if we're answering this question honestly for ourselves, someone might rightly say, well, actually, I'm not sure what human happiness is. I can agree with you that my happiness isn't to be found in pleasure, because I have received pleasure, and based on my own experience, that pleasure doesn't deliver continuous happiness. Once it fades away, I compulsively find myself seeking a new pleasure. But other than that, I can't tell you what my happiness is. Actually, that's why I find myself seeking. I'm seeking for a happiness I don't have. And so I can't answer this question for myself. So why not look at the unhappiness we find ourselves with from time to time in life? Take a moment when we say, in this moment, I'm absolutely clear that I am not happy. This I can confirm for myself. And if we look at that, we'll find that our unhappiness in life arises in one of 5 different forms: guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So as we investigate for ourselves, in moments when we say, happiness I'm not sure about, but in this moment I can say, I am not happy. The suggestion is that we'll find that in that moment there is one of these 5 forms of suffering or unhappiness arising: guilt, blame, pride, worry, anxiety, expectation, and attachment to outcome. And all of those forms of suffering, at their core, are felt as an uncomfortableness with oneself, or an uncomfortableness with the other, or an uncomfortableness with life. And peace of mind, the happiness that is being suggested as being human happiness, continuous unbroken peace of mind, is not actually the gaining of anything. but rather the falling away of the unhappiness that arises in the course of daily life. And so, if we agree that this is a good question to ask, what am I really looking for? And we drop all concepts. We say, actually, I just want to be happy. It's true. And if it makes sense to us, yes, I haven't found my happiness in pleasure, in circumstance. Yes, it's true that my unhappiness is one of these forms of suffering, that is an attitude to the flow of life as it happens to be. Guilt is an attitude whereby when something that happens through me delivers pain in the moment, guilt is a hatred of myself for what I did that delivered a painful outcome to someone that I love or to myself. And blame is an attitude towards what has happened through someone else that has delivered pain to me or someone I love. And therefore, blame is an attitude of hating the other for what they have done that has delivered pain in the moment. And pride is an attitude towards something that happens through me that delivers a positive outcome. And so we can see that the first three forms of suffering, guilt, blame, and pride, all arise on a belief that what happened through me or through the other was my doing or their doing and should have been different. And so if I see myself as the doer, when I do something that delivers pain in the moment, I'm forced to hate myself for what I have done, which we can call guilt. And to the extent that I see the other as the doer, meaning the other in control of everything that they think, that they say, that they feel, that they do. When the other does something that delivers pain to me, then I'm forced to hate them. And on that basis of seeing myself and the other as the doer, if I do something and the outcome is positive, then I feel proud. Look what I have achieved as the doer. And worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome is based on a belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, that my happiness is to be found in life being pleasurable or the absence of pain. And so, based on our own investigation of our own life experience, we can very quickly come to a conclusion that, wow, maybe it's true, maybe I am looking for happiness. I have been, like most humans, have been programmed to look for happiness in a place it's never to be found. Pleasure, outcomes, circumstance. And in fact, it could well be that my happiness is simply the absence of my unhappiness. Could it be that my unhappiness is always attitudinal and never circumstantial, meaning my attitude to what is happening in the flow of life? And if that turns out to be the case, and I see that my attitude to the flow of life that creates this uncomfortableness that arises from time to time is based on an attitude of seeing myself as the doer and the other as the doer, seeing my happiness as being something to be found in pleasure, 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 then I need to check out whether this attitude of doership and attachment to pleasure is accurate. And wisdom teachings for thousands of years have told us that suffering is an error. Suffering doesn't stem from our true nature. Suffering stems from a false idea of who we are. This is the reason that happiness is our birthright. Happiness is available for every human being in life. Happiness on a continuous, unbroken basis, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. It's available to us because of what our true nature, the essence of the human being, happens to be. Something unaffected by what happens in the flow of life. Now, the physical body clearly is affected by what happens in the flow of life. The physical body is part of the flow of life. But the essence of the human being, an essence that we may not be particularly familiar with, even though it is who we are, the essence of the human being is not affected by what happens in the flow of life. This we need to start confirming for ourselves. And to the extent that we are able to confirm this for ourselves, time and time again, each time that there is pain in the moment, if life has brought about access to that realm of being, a realm of being which exists outside of thinking, that when life is painful and we find ourselves involved and suffering as a result of the pain, if we can drop into being, where the thinking, the suffering about what is happening in the flow of life gets cut off, we might just find for ourselves, based on our own investigation, oh, it's true, I am, I exist. One moment there is suffering which is based on our attitude to the flow of life, which is a resistance of one form or another to what's happening in the flow of life. An attitude that is convinced that what is happening in the flow of life is an attack on who I am. And to the extent that life starts allowing us to drop into being, we might find, even in the face of pain, where one moment ago I was suffering, now the suffering has been cut off, and I find, I exist. And the more often we find ourselves connecting to that part of ourself, the part of ourself that doesn't change even when life is painful, the part of us that doesn't change when life is pleasurable. To the extent we start to ground into a connection with that, we start to see that there is the potential for an equanimity to be there. An attitude of witnessing life exactly as it is in the moment, without feeling that it's an attack on who I am. So we've all heard of life being referred to as a creation. And so in this set of pointers, it's said that life is a spontaneous creation of Source. Source at rest has exploded into manifestation, has become the story of life, from the beginning of time to the end of time. And life as we know it is the unfolding of that story of life. Source at rest, the unmanifest prior to the manifestation, prior to the existence of life as we know it, we could call pure potentiality, absolute nothing, the absence of manifestation, bubbling energy. And at some point, that pure potentiality explodes into manifestation, explodes into the story of time. And that story is unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, moment after moment after moment. And if that's how life is unfolding, exactly as it's created to unfold, exactly as it's destined to unfold, then the idea that I am the doer and the other is the doer is not particularly accurate. It is an attitude to what is happening that is not in line with seeing it as a creation of Source. And if that belief is in place, it's in place because it's part of the creation. It's destined to be in place. Life seems to be a story not only of time and space and duality, but a story of, for a period of time, suffering due to a forgetting of who we are and not knowing ourself, period of suffering, and then an awakening, a remembering, and the end of suffering. And so, if the forgetting is in place and all of life is a creation, then it makes sense that the forgetting is part of the creation. Not my doing, not anyone else's doing. And if we want to be able to investigate this and see it in practical terms, because the idea that it's all a spontaneous creation according to God's will or Source, to some people might seem a little esoteric. So how can we look at this in a more practical way? How can we come to see whether what happens through me is my doing or a happening? And the suggestion is that a human being in any moment is one way, the way they are in that moment, based on two factors. If we could find a third factor, then what I'm putting forward is maybe not so relevant. But I'm very confident that no matter how closely we look, we won't find a third factor. The two factors that make up the human being on a biological and psychological level are the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So we were born with a set of genes that we didn't choose. And then from the moment of conception, the genetic aspect, the biological aspect of the human being is conditioned moment after moment by the flow of life, which we're also not in control of. Largely, we're conditioned by the parents that we're born to, the country we're born into, the religious beliefs, the political beliefs, the friends that we make, the schools that we go to, the church that we go to or don't go to. Life is continually conditioning us moment after moment after moment. And how we get conditioned is not in our control. And so at any moment, the human being is a combination of these two factors, their genes and the up-to-date conditioning that life has delivered. And we find ourselves in a situation that we haven't been in control of, that we didn't have control over. And in that circumstance, we find a response or a reaction happening. And the response or reaction is based on how we are in that moment and the circumstance we find ourselves in. Two factors that we haven't had control over, and the circumstance we find ourselves in, not our control, which really leads us to a simple conclusion that how I think, how I feel and respond in a particular moment is actually much more a happening than my doing. We might like to look at it as though, for the analogy of two chemicals with a particular chemical composition, and when those chemicals come together, there is a reaction that happens based on the composition of each of the chemicals and the environment that they're in. And that reaction is not something that the chemicals are in control of. They don't sit down and have a conference and decide for themselves or amongst themselves how they're going to react. The reaction is a result of their makeup in that moment and the circumstance they find themselves in. And so this investigation, which we can do for ourselves in the course of daily living, where we find, it's true, I saw something, I heard something, I smelt something, I tasted something, I touched something. Something that I wasn't in control of seeing or hearing or smelling or tasting or touching. And as a result of that, a thought happens or an action happens. And thought or an action based on my makeup in that moment, based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And if this is seen clearly, then at some point we will have the realization, I simply cannot be the doer. In each moment, whatever happens through me is happening based on these two factors I've had no control over, and the circumstance I find myself in. Now, the belief in personal doership inside of us tends to really dislike hearing this. These concepts are a complete attack on that false sense of self. And so it makes sense that the reaction that can happen to hearing this, which is also not in our control but based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, can be a reaction that says, this is nonsense. Of course I'm the doer. Of course I'm in control. The suggestion here is not to believe anything I'm saying. It's to go back to this original question and say, actually, I want to know for myself, if I find myself seeking in life, I want to know what I'm really looking for. The suggestion, we're looking for happiness. What is happiness? It turns out that happiness is not to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. That we can verify for ourselves based on our own experience. It's true, pleasure is pleasurable, but it doesn't deliver continuous unbroken happiness. And then we ask ourselves, could it be that happiness is just the absence of human unhappiness, the absence of suffering? Is it true that this suffering is my unhappiness in practical terms when I sit with it for myself? Do I find that these different forms of suffering are my unhappiness? And is it true that they are based on an attitude to the flow of life, an attitude to the pleasure and pain in the moment? Is it true that these attitudes are not actually circumstantial? The circumstance is pleasure or pain. It will be pleasurable if the circumstance is in line with your biological preferences, and biological preferences are part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning that we had no control over. And something will be painful if it's out of line with the biological preferences. So that's in the flow of life, that's circumstantial. Is it true that my attitude is always, or my unhappiness is always attitudinal? So if we come to this conclusion, we might actually say, this is not bad news. I'm looking for happiness. It's not to be found in pleasure. I come to see that my unhappiness are these 5 forms. They are attitudinal, and furthermore, they're based on, my attitude is based on the belief I am the doer, the other is the doer, and that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. And based on a very simple investigation, we find that the human being in any moment is one way, the way that they have been designed by life based on their genes and their up-to-date conditioning, two factors that the human hasn't been in control of, and that the human, being the way they are, finds themselves in a circumstance that they're also not in control of. They see something, they hear something, smell something, taste something, or touch something. And that creates a thought or an action or a feeling. The other is the same. So based on a very simple investigation, we can come to the conclusion for ourselves, I simply cannot be the doer. And yet we see that when life unfolds a particular way, this relationship to life, this attitude to life arises. And if we investigate blame or guilt or pride, we find that at the base of it, there is this belief in doership, deeply ingrained by life up to this point in time. And so this process of transformation in practical terms is really quite simple. It's the dissolving of the false beliefs of who we are, the belief that I am the doer, the other is the doer, and that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And if those beliefs dissolve, what happens is we find that our attitude to life changes radically. So we don't have to work hard at being happy in each moment. We find ourselves naturally moving through life, life being pleasure sometimes and pain at other times. And if the beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome have fallen away, then there is the absence of these 5 forms of suffering. They simply don't have the basis on which to arise. And if the belief in doership and attachment is in place, then it's not optional for suffering to arise. It's forced to arise, which is why we find ourselves in life unable to prevent ourselves from reacting to life in a way that is inherently uncomfortable. And we say to ourselves, I have to accept things. I have to accept things as they are. I have to stop judging things. And yet, when we find ourselves in the face of pleasure or pain, non-acceptance arises. And we can find ourselves getting disappointed. Why can't I accept? I need to work harder at accepting. Whereas in fact, accepting is impossible to do when these beliefs are in place. That I'm the doer and the other is the doer, and that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. Life as it unfolds, which is always out of our control, and the nature of the flow of life is pleasure sometimes and pain at others. You know, no matter how hard we try, we're never going to be able to get it to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. If life unfolds the way that its nature is, which is pain sometimes, then with these beliefs in place, that I need life to be pleasure, 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 that my happiness is dependent on pleasure, 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 life is seen to be an attack on who I am. Because the beliefs are essentially an identity, a false identity. So we're forced to go around life seeing the other as a competitor or a rival or an enemy, someone who in any moment could deliver pain to me, which is an attack on who I am. We're forced to be afraid of life. Now this can sound disappointing, or so. It's actually really great news. We should be happy about this. What it's saying is that suffering, which is so common in life and actually turns out to be the obstacle, the veil to our happiness, which is just peace of mind, the absence of suffering. What it's saying is suffering is an error. It's a mistake. It's based on some primary errors that are in place in the system. 2, really. The belief that I'm the doer and the other is the doer, and that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. That's it, as simple as that. Life put the errors in place as part of our up-to-date conditioning, because the beliefs are part of our up-to-date conditioning. And life, at some point, starts to undo the errors. And it undoes the errors by simply delivering new conditioning that becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning. And so Ramesh used to sort of laugh a little bit when he said this. He said, make no mistake, these talks are simply new conditioning. This is simply life delivering new conditioning. As part of the story of life, you've found yourself here on a Friday night, listening to this talk, not in control of what I say. I'm not even in control of what I say. And so this is just life unfolding, and what I say is new conditioning that may or may not affect your current up-to-date conditioning. The new conditioning could have very little effect on your up-to-date conditioning, or it could radically change your up-to-date conditioning. If it radically changes your up-to-date conditioning, then you might find yourself exposed to the flow of life like we always are. Pleasure sometimes, pain at others. And if the beliefs in personal doership and attachment to outcome start to fall away due to a change in conditioning, we might find that the suffering might arise because some of the conditioning is still in place, and then a thought arises, this is guilt, or this is blame towards the other for what they have done that has delivered pain. This pain is part of the flow of life, something unavoidable, and actually my happiness, my completeness is not to be found in life being pleasure, 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 but actually in my attitude to the flow of life. The other is not the doer, I'm not the doer. So this thought could come up and cut off the blame. And in the moment that the blame is cut off, circumstance more or less the same as it was before, and the uncomfortableness with the situation falls away. The pain will remain, but the load of guilt or blame, pride, worry or expectation, that's completely attitudinal. And so what's being put forward as concepts can start off as an intellectual understanding. We could say, oh, I understand what is being said intellectually. I can't say I completely believe it, but at least I understand it intellectually. And then, throughout the course of our life, maybe in the next days, weeks, what we find is that the intellectual understanding starts to function automatically. And how the intellectual understanding functions is in a situation where we might find someone doing something that has delivered pain to us. And then blame arises, awareness lands on the fact that what has happened is someone has delivered pain, blame has arisen, and the intellectual understanding might kick in and say, oh, this is blame based on circumstance. The blame is attitudinal, based on the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. Then a thought might arise and say, well, actually, I know my happiness is never to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. I've received pleasure. It feels better than pain, but it doesn't provide me with ongoing contentment. It's short-lived, and very shortly after the pleasure, I seek more pleasure. So as this intellectual understanding starts to observe life in a way that maybe life hasn't been observed before, and we start to put ticks next to all of these concepts for ourselves based on our own investigation. You know, it really is pointless to come and believe what I say. If we just believe it and go around and say, oh, you know, this guy said that my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, that belief does not work. It isn't going to uproot the other deeply ingrained beliefs to the contrary. But as we start to see life for ourselves, the unfolding of life, in a way that maybe we haven't seen it before, and start putting ticks next to these concepts, that's when the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, not as a belief, but as a realization, as a recognition of the nature of life, the nature of suffering. So an example of how intellectual understanding can go deeper and deeper is this. Several years ago I was told by someone, you know, if you smile at a monkey, the monkey is going to take that as a sign of aggression. And I thought about it. It was strange, I'm smiling at a monkey. Why would think that that's a sign of aggression? And then it occurred to me, or they told me, you know, you're showing your teeth, and in monkey world, if you show your teeth, that means we want to fight or I'm going to kill you. And so I had a little laugh. Oh, right, okay, that's interesting. And, you know, just the way we we don't recognize some things sometimes. And when I was in India this year, I found myself walking up a mountain, and there were a lot of monkeys, and there was this baby monkey on a rock, and it wanted to play. It looked like it was only a few weeks old. It had the most fine little features, and its eyes were bulging out, and it was this little innocent monkey. And I was amazed that it was so fearless and just wanted to play. And at some point I felt this warm feeling in my heart, and this big smile came across my face. And as soon as the monkey jumped back a meter, screeching, and its mother came rushing over. And in that moment, this concept that was delivered to me by a friend several years ago that said, if you smile at a monkey, they're going to take it as a sign of aggression. So up to this point in time, it was just a concept, a belief in a sense. I didn't have the opportunity to verify it for myself based on my own experience. For all I knew, the belief was inaccurate. The concept that was put forward was inaccurate. And one experience doesn't mean that we can become convinced about it. If we do, we probably are believing something with not quite enough evidence. But to the extent that we can start putting ticks next to the concept for ourselves, the more ticks that we put next to it, the more we've actually seen what is being described by the concept for ourselves in action. And so in India, I was curious, so I smiled at a few more monkeys to check this out. And the next monkey I smiled at was a big monkey. And instead of it jumping back, it jumped towards me, and I jumped back. And so I got to put another tick next to the concept. And the third monkey I smiled at was on a suspension bridge, a big suspension bridge. It was out on one of the chunky pieces of wire that holds the bridge up. And it couldn't care less that I was smiling at it. It was out there, 10 meters away from me, eating, and it was looking at this human over there that couldn't get to where it was, and it was interested in its food, and it didn't respond. So I'm able to put ticks next to it, but I also say when a monkey is eating on a wire out there and you smile at it, it doesn't really care. So we have to investigate this and really come to understand the functioning of life for ourselves. So, concept. Our happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. The flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain. That's two concepts. My happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. Concept. The flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain. Concept. Intellectually, we can say, I understand that what you're saying, the flow of life, meaning circumstance as it unfolds moment after moment after moment, is only ever pleasure and pain. Another concept here, pleasure is when circumstance is in line with our biological preferences, concept. Pain is when circumstance is out of line with our biological preferences, concept. So someone says, yeah, I understand what you're saying. That means that the intellectual understanding is there. So then we find ourselves going through life and we stub our toe on the wall. Pain in the moment. So we can register pain is when the circumstance is not in line with my biological preferences. And so we can tick, that is physical pain in the moment. If we open the fridge and see a bowl of strawberries and we put a strawberry in our mouth and there's a sensation and we pleasure. The circumstance is in line with my biological preferences. To the extent that someone comes and says, you know, I think what you say is a load of nonsense. That, relative to someone saying, hey, you know, I really got a lot out of what you said tonight. Compare the two. I prefer to hear someone say, you know, thanks, that was great, instead of, actually, I think you're a fool. My biological preferences prefer one over the other. So we could call it emotional pain in the moment versus emotional pleasure in the moment. If I find that I open my wallet and the $100 that I thought that I knew was in my wallet is now gone, and I realize that when I left it on the table at the shop, someone must have stolen the $100 out of my wallet, then that's financial pain in the moment. My preference would be that the money hadn't been stolen, but that's not the case, so financial pain. And if I'm booking an airline ticket on the internet and I find one that I like and it's $600 and I say, I'm going to book that, and then the phone rings and I forget to book it and come back tomorrow and it's $800. Financial pain relative to if I had booked it when it was 600. And if I come back the next day and it's 400, then that's financial pleasure. So the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. And to the extent that we start being able to verify this, someone yells at us in the shopping center, I go, emotional pain in the moment, not my preference, but actually the circumstance is either pleasurable or painful. We're walking down the street and the sun is really hot. Pain in the moment. We get in the shower and the water is the perfect temperature. Pleasure in the moment. We can start to observe life in a way that maybe we hadn't before. And to the extent we do that, the intellectual understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, another of the really important concepts, our happiness, never to be found in the flow of life. Our happiness is always a result of our attitude to the flow of life. It turns out that our unhappiness is also attitudinal, not circumstantial. Remember the circumstance, pleasure or pain. If we have the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 then when circumstance is painful, what we end up with is an attitude of resistance to the pain because we believe it's an attack on who I am. And so we see that that is attitudinal, based on a belief system. And so if our unhappiness is attitudinal and our happiness is attitudinal, then we must ask ourselves, so what is my attitude to life that creates unhappiness? And what is the attitude that creates happiness? And as we spoke about before, human happiness, which is the birthright of every human, is simply the absence of suffering. The attitude on which suffering arises is the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. I am the doer, meaning I see myself as a separate, independent entity in complete control of everything that I think, feel, act, etc. My doing. I chose that based on my own free will, my own volition. I am the doer. I make a choice unaffected by anything else. I'm in control. And the other is the same, in control of everything that happens through them. That's the attitude that life has put in place, based on the beliefs that life has put in place, that is our unhappiness. And it turns out that the attitude that delivers peace of mind, which turns out to be the birthright of the human being, the happiness that's available, is simply peace of mind regardless of circumstance, is simply the absence of the other attitude. Not something we have to work hard on. Don't have to work hard on being at peace. It's there, it's the background, it's our true nature. It's our true nature once the false beliefs of who I am fall away. So if we have a false idea of who we are, then it's that identity effectively that lives life. That idea of who I am that is out there in the flow of life. And when that false idea of who I am falls away, we find that life can unfold exactly as it's destined to unfold, pleasure sometimes, pain at others. And there's an equanimity, a witnessing, a peace. And the peace stems from being connected to who we are, realizing that at the core of my being, the essence of the human being, which is not physical, not biological, I'm not affected by the flow of life. So remember, the human being, as I described it, was based on two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning. But that was the biological and the psychological aspect of the human being. The aspect which is ever present in life, the awareness, the sense of existence, isn't stemming from the biological or psychological aspects of the human being. The awareness that is ever present is a result of the consciousness of Source, the one consciousness of Source, linking to a particular body-mind organism, a vehicle essentially, and then functioning through that vehicle as personal consciousness. Personal consciousness is the experience we have in each moment of life from a particular perspective, a perspective that feels like my perspective. So impersonal consciousness of Source, linking to a particular body and functioning through that body as personal consciousness. It's the same consciousness that links to every human being, the same one consciousness that is impersonal in nature, doesn't have an age or a gender, doesn't have preferences. It simply has these two functions of awareness and being, and it links to the 7 billion different vehicles, experiencing life from 7 billion different perspectives, So the idea that there is God out there is a concept that we have of God. And to the extent that we can start to become more present with the aspect that is not physical, not biological, not psychological, the aspect that is ever present in each moment, and realize that that is functioning through the biological. And it is that consciousness that is aware of each moment. And that consciousness is the consciousness not of the body, but functioning through the body. Just like white light functioning through a red or a green or a blue filter, coming through as red, green or blue light. And the essence of the red, green or blue light, which is determined by the color of the filter, so the red light, at the essence of the red light is white light. And the body is like the filter through which impersonal consciousness functions and experiences life in what we could call a personal consciousness experience. And to the extent that we can ground into this being at the point where impersonal consciousness turns into personal consciousness, which in the human being is in the heart area, the chest. Not the physical heart, but what we can call the spiritual heart. And a connection to the heart is never to be found through thinking, never to be found in our head. It happens when the obsessive thinking that is trying to get somewhere, trying to find myself in the future, when the obsessive thinking that is trying to become complete through outcomes stops and we drop into being. And we find, oh, I am. So resting here is the point at which we know ourselves both as impersonal consciousness and then recognize that's where it turns into personal consciousness. And knowing ourselves as that, being that, starts to provide first-hand experience that confirms my happiness isn't to be found in the future. My happiness wasn't attacked by what happened in the past. My happiness isn't, my completeness doesn't get added to or subtracted from. I am. Each time I drop into that place, I find I am complete. I am as I always have been. And furthermore, we find that there is peace there. A peace that is there because there is the absence of the guilt, of the blame, of the pride, the worry and anxiety, the absence of the expectation in the future, and attachment to outcomes being a particular way. So, does anyone have any comments or questions to make?
Near the end, you just said the heart, and that was very brief. Could you add a little or open it a little?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I tend sometimes to put less emphasis on that, because that's actually always there. It's who we are. And what covers it up is the thinking based on these beliefs that have been put in place by life. And once we start seeing that the thinking is based on a false idea of who we are, beliefs that this is what I need, that I am the doer, in control of everything that I think, say and do. The other is the same, the doer. And once we start seeing life as a happening, not as my doing, from our own investigation, and start dropping into this place of being, then as those beliefs fall away, then we become more connected in the heart. And so a lot of emphasis is placed on pointing out suffering and the beliefs in suffering. Because once those beliefs fall away, there's not really much need to speak about the heart, because that's where we find ourselves. But having said that, there is value in talking about the heart as well. In fact, the two work together. One, knowing that there is this place of being, and simultaneously also understanding that what keeps us away from this place of being is the obsessive thinking, the obsessive attitude to life that we haven't put in place. So we're not guilty of this error being in place. What's being suggested here is that this is a story of life that is designed to unfold exactly the way it unfolds. So let's put the suffering aside and talk about the heart. The heart is a timeless realm that is not ever created by thinking. It's a realm that exists prior to thought. It's a realm in which we can know ourselves in any moment. And so one way in which we can find ourselves dropping into the heart more regularly is if life delivers certain new conditioning, which, now that I'm going to explain this practice, which in the end turns out not to be so much a practice but a happening. If life delivers new conditioning, then we can find the thinking mind, which is all of the guilt and blame, pride, worry, getting cut off, and we find ourselves dropping into being many times a day, at first only for small periods of time. Small periods of time because we'll get dragged out of there by the momentum of the old form of thinking. But to the extent that this practice happens more and more, we find ourselves more capable of resting in being for longer, until one day we realize, oh, this is the home. This is where I can live life from. And to the extent that it becomes clear based on our own investigation of what's being spoken about tonight. So we're not going to be able to do the investigation here and now. The investigation happens tomorrow and the day after and the day after that and next week and next month. As we go through life, living life as we're destined to live life. And then the intellectual understanding automatically starts seeing things. So that's when the investigation is going to happen for ourselves in our own daily life experience. To the extent that the investigation highlights that, yes, there's a whole lot of thinking, which is attitudinal, which is based on beliefs that are no longer seen to be as accurate as I used to see them. And I realize that this suffering is actually just an uncomfortableness with oneself, that it is what disturbs my peace of mind. So to the extent that all of this understanding starts to happen, then the thought, I am, might start arising. I am is a thought which effectively includes in it, because of this process that has happened, the understanding that all suffering is pointless. It doesn't deliver what I previously thought it would. We blame the other because we think it's going to serve a purpose to blame the other. We have expectations in the future, and we resist the moment when it's painful because we think there's benefit in that. To the extent that we see that this attitude delivers nothing except uncomfortableness in the moment, then the thought, I am, might arise and cut off that thinking. And in the moment that the thinking is cut off, because it's seen to be an error, we might find ourselves dropping into being. And what can help that dropping into being is if we start practicing opening up our field of awareness, our field of vision, so that we're not so focused on any one object. We allow the whole momentary experience to arise and be seen. So we have peripheral vision and the complete vista. So opening up our field of vision can loosen our insistence on remaining in the head, and can allow the center of consciousness to drop down into the body. And so you can actually start living life with this more open vision. And if it starts to become obvious that the home of the center of consciousness that spends so much time up in our head is actually in our chest, there can be a double effect. We open up our field of vision and allow the center of consciousness to drop down into the chest. Almost visualize it being dragged down by gravity, dragged down to a place that is its home. And as we rest with this open vision, allowing everything to be exactly as it is, and allowing the center of consciousness to drop down into the heart, we might automatically find, it's much easier to just be, to not need to think. So to the extent that the thought, I am, arises, which is just a reminder to drop back into being, a reminder that also knows that the obsessive thinking is based on an error and doesn't serve a purpose. Then when we find ourselves going through our day, and then there's a realization, I'm thinking about the past, I'm thinking about the future based on this ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and that I see myself as the doer and the other as the doer. So we realize that the mind is thinking along this storyline. Awareness lands on that. And then the thought automatically, based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So in this moment, some new conditioning is being thrown out by life, and it may become part of our up-to-date conditioning, and it might inspire the thought, I am, to cut off thinking when it's recognized, and we might find ourselves opening up our field of vision and dropping into being, all simultaneously in an instant. And really this place of being potentially remains unregistered as being a place from which life can be lived, can remain unregistered for our whole life. Meaning that we can live our whole life up in our head, judging and assessing life through our belief systems. And so I won't do it justice, I haven't read it for a long time, but there's a Rumi poem there is a field. Does anyone know it really well?
I used to, but no.
No.
Right now I'm
So-
really deep into what you're saying, so I have to.
So it says, beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, life is too full to talk about. Something along those lines. And so what it's pointing at when it says there is a field out there beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing. So the ideas of right doing and wrong doing is pointing at the functioning of our thinking mind that is always looking at things as good or bad, right or wrong. Saying, that is how I would like it to be. It's in line with my preferences and I need pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. That's not in line with my preferences. I don't want life to be like that. So out beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. And the field is this field of awareness, this field of being. That's never to be found in the head, always to be found in the body and in the heart. And it's pointing at the fact that when we rest there, we find a fullness, a completeness, that what we are at our core, in our essence, is complete. And yet, we've been conditioned to live life through our beliefs that life has put in place. And if that's the case, if there is never an awareness that these beliefs keep me disconnected from what I am at my core, if that's never realized, then this field, this dimension outside of thinking, where we connect to what we really are, can go unrecognized. So that's why there's so much emphasis on trying to highlight what the suffering is. It's all thought. Highlight that it's all based on false beliefs of who we are. And then also point to the fact that there is this space of being, and show that the thinking, when it's believed to be true, keeps us outside of that space of being. And that the methodology that life puts in place in order to bring us into this place of being is the recognition of this, this dynamic, and then the cutting off of the thinking, which allows us to rest in being more and more often.
First of all, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I was joking with you earlier about how I needed a refresher course. But what's happening is something very different. As I'm sitting here now, I'm starting to have this sense of how sublime the relief is not to surrender to the character that you are, because so much of the suffering comes from the resistance to who you are and what you're doing and what people are doing to you, what you're doing to others, and just there's a resistance to the way we are in the world. So to actually surrender to the fact that you're not in control of that is an incredible relief.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So even to the extent that suffering arises, if these pointers get turned into an idea, this is what I have to do, is stop suffering, then even that's a resistance to the suffering that may be there. And that at some point might be realized as, that's the doer coming in trying to control life and resist life as it is. So, as the inevitable suffering happens from time to time, once our conditioning is such that it is able to become aware of the many different forms of suffering, then they start to fall away. And as you rightly said, most of our suffering is a judgment of ourself for being right or wrong, good or bad. And that judgment of ourself as being appropriate or inappropriate, good or bad, worthy, is all based on our attachment to outcome. The deepest attachment to outcome is an attachment to love. Because when we lose touch with who we are, the deeply ingrained error that life has put in place is that I am not worthy, I'm not lovable, right at the bottom. And so the seeking for pleasure, pleasure, pleasure is really deep down a seeking for love. Because we believe that we've been kicked out of home, this is what I would refer to as the original sin. Now, sin in this context means error. So sin in Latin really means error. So the original error that life has put in place as part of this story of life is the error that I have been kicked out of Source. I suddenly appear in this incarnate form. I was in non-duality, in the unmanifest, and then I come out into this duality, and it's like, why have I appeared here? Why am I? And then another metaphor of this is the baby being born and cut off from the mother. It's like I've been thrown out of Source, and I'm now separate and need to fend for myself. I'm all alone. And so these are deeply, deeply, deeply unconscious beliefs that life has put in place. We didn't, this is not something that we've concluded. And from that place, the movement in life is to prove that we are lovable. So we're looking for love. And that's never the solution. That's what the error, the original error that has been put in place by life, that's what the error is telling us the solution is. To be lovable. The error says you've been thrown out because you're not good enough. So ultimately, at the root of the false idea of who we are, there is shame. And so that drives us in a certain way to get certain feedback. Feedback that we think, if I get this feedback, then I'll be able to prove that I'm lovable. And it's completely, all of that is based on a disconnection, a non-recognition of what we are at our core. And so that's why we need to be reminded that there is this space of being And then it becomes much more obvious that however I am biologically is not my doing. And I don't need to judge myself as being good enough or not good enough. That my completeness exists even when biologically I have my good points and my bad points. And if we're not connected to that essence of the human being that knows itself to be complete, then we find ourselves completely identified with just the physical aspect of the human, and we're going to continue trying to become perfect, judging the others for not being perfect, which is blame, judging ourselves for not being perfect, and when we do find that things happen through us and they are positive, then we're claiming own pride. Look, everyone, see how good I am? Please acknowledge my goodness. And if you acknowledge my goodness, that's why I'm going to have to show everyone everything, then maybe I'll be able to believe that I'm good enough. So, this is, yes, this is life.
So you talked about like chemicals and how when they're in a environment and they're defined by who they are, they'll create something. So like blue paint and red paint combined would make purple paint. Do you think that humans are just really complicated bags of chemicals in a way? Like that that it might be possible for something to actually predict the future because we always know it will make purple.
Yeah. The analogy is pointing at the fact that humans are effectively a very complex bunch of chemicals, and that in each moment they will react exactly as they're destined to react, given a particular circumstance. And an analogy that might be useful to expand on what you're bringing up again is a pool table with a set of red balls, a triangle of red balls, and a white ball. And someone has a cue and is about to hit the white ball onto the red ball, and his friend says, "Hold on one sec, I have this really cool computer simulator, and I want to show you that everything is predetermined." And the friend says, "Okay, let's do it." And he says, "Tell me at what angle you're going to hit the white ball and how hard you're going to hit the white ball." And so they come up with the information, put it into the computer, press simulate, and on the computer the white ball hits the red balls and they all start bouncing off. And at some point everything comes to a standstill. And there's a snapshot of all the balls on the table. And then go ahead, hit the white ball at the same angle and the same force. And his friend does that, hits it at the right angle with exactly the right amount of force. And all of the balls start moving around the table exactly as they did on the computer simulator, and end up exactly as the computer simulator picture says. And the friend says, "Wow, that's amazing. How's this?" And his friend says, "Well, in a closed environment, if you understand the laws of physics, you can see what is going to happen next." And that's what the computer does. And life, starting from the Big Bang, is simply, on a biological and psychological level, physics. And life is so complex, with so many variables, that we as humans are never going to be able to create a computer that is able to understand all the variables. And so the computer is not going to be able to tell us what the final picture is going to be. But the theory, the principle is the same. Just because we don't have a computer that can tell us what the outcome is going to be, the outcome happened at the very initial impulse. But as the doership aspect of the human doesn't recognize that how the human functions in each moment is simply based on these two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so the belief that's being put in place is that there is a me as a chooser, a me that chooses what I do next. And this belief of a me simply doesn't recognize the actual mechanism that is happening when a choice is made. And so the belief is actually part of destiny. It's there because all of the different variables reacted with each other to create a belief of a me, which is simply a misinterpretation of what life is, what the human being is on a biological and psychological level. And so with that belief, we'll say, well, but there's this unknown factor, which is the me, the doer, me, the controller. But that me doesn't exist. The me is actually the thoughts that arise are based on the brain, which is basically a biological machine. And I was interested at one time, listening to a documentary of Stephen Hawking, and he at one point said, thinking is simply physics. Thinking is electromagnetics in a neural network. And that's the aspect that we tend to underappreciate, is that what we consider my thought is actually a happening as a result of something that we see, smell, taste, touch, and hear. And that's a stimulus that comes in and creates a response. So what's your name? Foster. So you are forced to answer that way based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance you found yourself in. And I was forced to ask the question based on my genes and conditioning and the circumstance that I found myself in. A question that we ordinarily would say, well, that was my doing. I was in control of asking that question. And ordinarily, the attitude is that, from your perspective, the answer was my doing. I answered Foster of my own free will and volition. And these set of pointers are saying, well, actually, you answered the way you answered because that was the only way you could have answered based on the particular circumstance and your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the idea that we have, well, I could have said anything. I could have said, my name is Chicken. That's, once again, that's a new idea in that moment as a result of like the conversation, which is effectively circumstance that you're not in control of, I'm not in control of, it's just happening. And so the idea that says, I could have answered chicken, is an imagination based on a misunderstanding of the functioning, because actually we will only ever answer one way, the way we answer, based on the circumstance and the genes and up-to-date conditioning. For you to have answered differently would have meant either the circumstance was different or your genes and up-to-date conditioning were different. Which means when someone treats you a certain way in a particular situation, that's much less personal than we believe. It's a happening. The other person is forced to react that way, and then when we react to the way they react, it's a happening to the extent that we can start to see life like this for ourselves, like realize, wow, could this be true? And investigate it. If it's our destiny for this investigation to unfold and for it to deliver insights, then what happens is we find that our relationship to life starts to change along with the change in our up-to-date conditioning.
So you kind of told this story about the pool table in one of the other videos that I have watched. And as a result of that, there was huge insight of the cause and effect when it happened. And so that insight lasted for a while, and all the doership dropped away. But it doesn't stick. So then what? So there's, insight, and so that gets sort of frustrating after. And does that change after a while, or?
Well, it will unfold exactly as it's destined to unfold.
Of course.
And the realization that I'm not the doer, the other isn't the doer, and that life, including my belief systems, are destined. So your own observation that a certain analogy or example can trigger certain thoughts, certain insights, and that they will or won't become part of your up-to-date conditioning. The fact that it triggers the insights probably is a result. It means that it has become part of your up-to-date conditioning, but not in such a way that it has completely uprooted the old beliefs. And so to the extent that life continues to create an investigation that delivers more and more insight, that's the understanding going deeper and deeper and deeper. If we start getting frustrated that it isn't going deeper and deeper and deeper, that too is destined to be there in that moment, because that's our psychological thinking arising in that moment, which is part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, so it's destined to be like that. To the extent that we see that that's what's happening, and that frustration is a form of suffering, and it's based on wanting life to be a particular way, then we can maybe surrender to the fact that, I'm not in control of how things unfold. And that might sound like defeat, it might sound like an unfortunate situation, I'm not in control, but the very realization that I'm not in control is taking us closer to the understanding that life ultimately puts in place if peace of mind is going to be there. So this deep realization time and time again, I'm not in control of how the conditioning is, what sinks in or what doesn't sink in. On the surface it sounds like I don't want to admit that, because that doesn't sound very good for me. When we find ourselves seeing it, that is the understanding going deeper. That is the belief in doership dissolving. That is the attitude of non-doership, we could call it, which is simply the absence of the attitude of doership. And we see all of the suffering is based on that attitude of doership. So what we think is not good for us to admit, I'm not in control. What we think is not good for us actually is the undoing of the belief on which all suffering arises.
I think I'm a slow learner.
The fact is that the beliefs are deeply, deeply ingrained. They're deeply, deeply ingrained because for our whole life, the circumstance on the surface, the experience on the surface, demonstrates I am the doer. When we're really present with the experience says you are the doer, the other is the doer. And so, and this has been happening from about the age of 2 years old, that the experience is like this. And so it makes sense that the deeply ingrained belief is I am the doer and the other is the doer. It's a spiritual transformational process kicking in and starting that gets us to look below the surface, to start seeing things on a deeper level. And as we start seeing dynamics in life, maybe as are being described here, that we haven't looked at before, as we start seeing it, we start then having to question the beliefs that were put in place by the experience which was assessed on a surface level only. And so really what life is doing is it is sometimes slowly uprooting deeply, deeply ingrained beliefs that have been put in place by years and years and years of the experience feeling a certain way, and of all of society confirming that yes, your happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 and outcomes. You have to succeed, you have to, all of our conditioning from societies is confirming this erroneous idea of myself. So it can be a slow process. But on the other hand, it could be very quick, because what is being recognized actually is not that complicated. So it's really a matter of grace grace is another term for destiny unfolding. And when destiny unfolds in a way that seems magical, where suddenly in an instant we just say, I simply cannot be the doer. That we can call grace. And it can happen in an instant. The Ramesh used to say, if we surrender to the idea I'm not in control, we shouldn't be pessimistic, because we are a very few, small, tiny percentage of the world's population that on a Friday night finds themselves sitting in this sort of environment, listening to new conditioning that life is putting forward that suggests something radically different to what most of life tells us. So we go, I'm not in control, and not being in control, which means destiny is dictating where I am at each moment, go, I'm not in control, but destiny is dictating that I'm here in this moment. Listening to concepts that are directly designed by life to undo the error. And so Ramesh said, no need to be pessimistic.
May I ask 2 questions?
Yes.
Okay. So the first one, I think you kind of maybe answered my question, but I want to make sure. Is there a mind that accompanies the essence beyond the body? Mm-hmm. When you talked about the heart, I think you kind of answered that maybe not, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, so you see, when we're pointing at our being, and some teachings will say you are not the body, you are consciousness. And that concept is very useful at sort of, in a way, getting our attention to land on the consciousness and not the biological aspect. But at the end of the day, there needs to be an integration of our thinking that comes to see, the body and consciousness actually never arise separately. Mm-hmm. They do in meditations, let's say, but in practical daily living, the body and the consciousness are there simultaneously in the experience. So we end up living as Roger, for example, meaning doing in each moment what I'm destined to do biologically, experiencing the pleasure and pain of this body's preferences and the circumstance it finds itself in, and simultaneously being connected to a part of ourself that we know to be complete and unchanging. And in that, there is thinking. Thinking doesn't come to an end. Often we hear enlightenment is the end of thinking. But it isn't the end of thinking, it's the end of a specific type of thinking. So if we introduce the notion of the thinking mind and the working mind is functional and practical and needs to carry on for the rest of our life. will be what is functioning. If someone asks a question, then the answer is given. If we're at the shops and we're trying to decide which tin of tomatoes is the best, and we're reading the ingredients, looking at the price, and etc., all of that is the functioning of the working mind. The thinking mind is the part of the mind that includes the false ideas of who we are and what we need, and resists and there's this attitude of guilt and blame and pride. So the thinking mind can dissolve. So peace of mind is the end of a specific type of thinking. And these concepts are being delivered and can be received by the working mind, the functional mind. So the intellectual understanding becomes part of the functional mind. And when we find ourselves going through life and an investigation happens, for example, the investigation is the combination of awareness that lands on a situation, lands on maybe suffering that's arising at a particular moment, awareness, and the working mind. The working mind says, that's blame. Blame is based on a belief that the other is the doer. Now, that thinking isn't suffering. That thinking is very functional. And it's that thinking in conjunction with the awareness that allows the understanding to go deeper and deeper and deeper. If the awareness lands on the blame, and then a thought arises, this blame shouldn't be here because this blame is the obstacle to my peace of mind. And then the thinking starts resisting the blame. That's not the function of the working mind, that's the function of the thinking mind. Based on this idea that I shouldn't be thinking like this, that I'm in control of what I think and what I don't think, that I should do better. So all of that is in the thinking mind. So there is definitely a function of thinking or intellect that is a useful function. And so if you look at Buddhism, the word Buddhism stems in part from the word Bodhi. Bodhi means intellect. And in jnana yoga, this type of spiritual path, which is based on a whole lot of pointers and concepts, is part of jnana yoga, the yoga of wisdom. And it talks about the sharpened or the honed intellect, the intellect that becomes so well tooled or equipped that it starts picking out, along with the awareness that lands on the situation, it starts seeing life and understanding life according to a more accurate set of concepts.
But beyond the body, like when the body dies, there is still mind joined with the essence, and is it necessary, or it is just the essence that, like...
Without the body, there would be no experience in this assessment of life. The evidence we have is that life exists when there is awareness. And when the body dies, the vehicle through which the awareness functions is no longer there, and there is no experience. So even the function of awareness falls away. And so when the body dies, the essence of Source returns back to Source, but it returns to Source in its resting form, where even the function of being and awareness are absent, so absolute nothing. And when a new birth happens, the body is created and consciousness connects to that body.
So the second question is, if our destiny, I assume that our destiny, somewhat also on the base of what you're saying, is designed from the moment of separation when we come in the body until the moment of joining again, uniting with the source. And if it doesn't happen in this lifetime, so are we coming back in many lifetimes until this is accomplished? And when we talk about destiny, are we talking about from the A to Z, or are we talking about just this one linear time zone? And if there are many and there is no mind then who decides? How does that separation happen, that I, as I, come back to finish this destiny?
Yeah, I need a whole satsang to answer that
I
question.
know. Sorry. It wasn't two questions. It's two long questions. Sorry.
So just very briefly, because we're also coming to the end of our time, so hopefully we'll have time over the weekend for those that come back to explore these questions. Destiny refers to the destiny of the individual and also to the destiny of all of life from the beginning of time to the end of time. So if we look at destiny from the beginning of time to the end of time, it includes in it all of the individual destinies. It's a story of life, a story of, in whatever, 7 billion people as we look at it now. And at some point, dinosaurs were the most complex vehicle through which consciousness was functioning. And the story was a story of evolution, and now there are more complex vehicles that consciousness is functioning through and experiencing life from. And in the story, it appears as if there's a continuation of lives that are linked to each other. And so from one perspective, we can see that anything that is unresolved in a particular lifetime, unresolved desires, unresolved fears, unresolved talents, when the body dies, that energy, not a soul, not an individual soul, but just data of unresolved energy is stored somewhere and then inserted into a new incarnation. So a new birth can come into life with up-to-date conditioning from a previous birth, and then live life according to its destiny. So it was its destiny to be born with that conditioning from a past life. Not necessarily its past life, because it, whatever it is, Roger, for example, exists because of the impersonal consciousness of Source functioning through this body. So when the body dies, no question of Roger existing, there's just impersonal consciousness. And then another birth happens. And so that person isn't a carry-on from a previous birth or death. It's a new person, but what can get carried over are some of the unresolved energies from another birth. And that then creates the impression that there is a continuation of a soul, but the idea of a soul, the concept of it, it's a concept that exists as part of life, and when we really look at the concept of a soul, it's subtly linked to the concept of doership and separation. And so to the extent that life starts to recondition ourselves where we maybe drop our concept of a migrating soul, transmigrating soul, we might actually find ourselves in a position to see life differently. Because even a belief of a soul can basically imply life to be a certain way that maybe it's not.
Okay. You don't mind if I ask about this more later on?
No, sure. So as not to drag people out longer than they might have planned to be, I think this is a good time to stop. For those who are here for the rest of the weekend, or those that think it could be interesting, you're very welcome. And I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.